I agree. I think if China did go after Taiwan, if they didn't get the timings right, it could turn into a complete disaster. Taiwan has prepared some very significant defenses. It would not be an easy operation. China has built an awful lot of very specialist equipment that has got one role and one role only, and that is to take islands. In particular, I saw pictures over the last year of specialist barges that have got 100-meter ramps, and they can connect together, and they've got pylons that can be driven into the sand so that they can create floating harbours like the Mulberry harbours that were used during the Second World War as the Allies invaded Northwest Europe through Normandy. They've only got one purpose. And they're very expensive to build, and they're expensive to maintain, and therefore, that indicates to me that Xi Jinping has made the decision to invade Taiwan. He's just waiting for when, and that when will be an economic decision. That economics will be if he believes that he can ride out the wrath of the international community and international community sanctions, or if the economic conditions inside China suggest that the Chinese people may be becoming unhappy with Xi Jinping and Chinese Communist Party's leadership. It's always a way of deflecting away from domestic issues by invading another country. Vladimir Putin has tried to deflect away from his unrest at his dictatorship in Russia by invading Ukraine. He's losing that. Xi Jinping will be watching it very closely.
Let's cover also one, I think, the most interesting moment during this parade in Moscow and summit between authoritarian leaders. Chinese President Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin discussed the possibility of living up to 150 years. Putin also responded, saying that with the development of biotechnology, human organs can be transplanted and people can live younger and even achieve immortality. Do you see this as Vladimir Putin's objective right now?
I think it's Vladimir Putin's objective, it's Xi Jinping's objective, and I think Kim Jong-un has gone, oh, there's a good idea. Of course, in China, there is a program of when prisoners get executed, their organs are harvested. And therefore, I suspect that a lot of those organs will be transplanted into senior members of the Chinese Communist Party if they need organ transplants. Of course, we've had transplantation surgery for many, many years, and it is becoming increasingly successful. But whether it is at the point where it can be successful to give people life up to 150 years or not, I think that is ambitious. But it's certainly something that in the future, with the development in medical technologies, not just transplant, but gene editing and other medical advancements, I don't think we're long off being able to have people to do that. From my perspective, would you want to live to 150? And there are certain conditions that no matter how good your transplantation surgery is, no matter how good your gene editing capabilities are, or anything else, if you have problems within your brain and certain other organs, those are incurable. And we're a long way off, I think, 150 years as a lifespan.
Also, do you see this as indications that Vladimir Putin is not ready to go somewhere and is not ready to depart from power, and he is looking at any kind of ways to prolong his life, not only physical life but also life at power?
Yeah, I don't see any indications whatsoever that Vladimir Putin is ready to give up power. And it's very clear that his ambition is to stay in power as long as possible. There was lots of rumors about him being extremely ill. There's no real evidence of that we've seen. Either he wasn't ill or he's made a miraculous recovery. Maybe that's down to some of these medical fantasies that he was talking with Xi Jinping about. But no, Putin, I think, will stay in power for as long as possible. And interestingly, I was talking about this with Bill Browder on a program in the UK only earlier this week. And he was saying if Putin then leaves because he dies or something else disastrous happens, then the oligarchs that are keeping him in place will have a Vatican-type conclave where they will elect the new leader because they rely on there being a strong leader in place for them to continue their illegal businesses and their criminal activity underpinning the Russian political system. And therefore they'll try and do that very quickly indeed. And of course, some of them are even worse than Vladimir Putin. So I think Putin's legacy, even if Putin doesn't live on, Putin's legacy will live on for quite some time. There are no suggestions at the moment that that is anywhere near collapse.
Let's cover also the recent summit of the coalition of the willing and this, I would call, weird phone call between Europeans and US President Donald Trump. What is your assessment of the main results of this summit?
I think there are two main results that are coming out of this. One is an increasing agreement between the coalition of the willing from the European perspective. And President Macron is going to make an announcement about, I think he said 28 countries have agreed to supply capability should there be a peace agreement or a ceasefire agreement in Ukraine. And that capability could be from external logistic support through to boots on the ground. We're a long way off getting a detailed plan for who would do what. And what it would look like. But Donald Trump is feeling increasingly isolated. And he's beginning to realize more publicly that Vladimir Putin is playing him and that Vladimir Putin is making Donald Trump look like a fool. And European leaders, I think, are very carefully but quite firmly suggesting to Donald Trump that he is a fool, and he's being perceived as that across the international community, and he's being perceived as weak because he has threatened Putin, but then not followed that through in any way, shape or form. He has given Putin a platform which has emboldened him, which was the summit in Alaska. And Trump, I don't think, knows where to turn at the minute. He seems very indecisive whenever he's making his statements about Putin and about his future support for Ukraine and his future views on the war in Europe. And I think that is causing Donald Trump some real difficulties at the moment.
Also, US President Donald Trump told European allies on Thursday that Europe must stop buying Russian oil, that he is helping Moscow to fund its war. Is this an effort to put more pressure on Vladimir Putin, or just another blame game from the US?
Well, I think it's a very valid point because European nations, members of the EU, are still buying Russian oil and gas, and I think the Ukrainian attack on the pipelines that were supplying into some European countries have hurt them. But I think Donald Trump is just right. Europe can't turn around and say, in one hand, we need the US to step up and do more to support Ukraine and to put sanctions on Russia if European countries are helping to fund Russia's illegal invasion of Ukraine. So, but it also allows Donald Trump to deflect a little bit of his decision making and therefore blame Europe for not giving the support that it is asking the United States to do, and therefore to put off his decision making a little bit and say he's trying to balance off what he needs to do with what Europe is doing and what Russia is doing. So Europe needs to step up and stop purchasing any oil and gas products from Russia. It needs to step up its sanctions against the Russian shadow fleet. It needs to step up its sanctions against countries that are buying Russian oil and gas products and buying other products. And it needs to start sanctions against countries that are supplying components, whether they be weapons components or what are classed as dual-use components, civilian items that can be used for military purposes to Russia. And when Europe steps up and does that, I think United States will feel even more isolated.
And also, how do you see this post-war security guarantees? There have been lots of media reports about that, about the Financial Times reported about the three lines of defense. The first line would be Ukrainian troops, the second line could be demilitarized zone with neutral third countries troops, and the third line with European forces. Also, Financial Times suggested that Trump was considering deploying Chinese peacekeepers to Ukraine. Lots of rumors and discussions are on this topic. What is your take on that?
There's a lot of rumors and discussions because people want to be able to talk about numbers of troops on the ground, pieces of equipment, length of time it takes, how much it's going to cost. We're a long, long way off that. I'm a military planner by background. I have planned a number of operations and implementing peacekeeping operations, from the Dayton Peace Agreement in Bosnia right through, and the complexities around Ukraine are phenomenal, and therefore every option will be being looked at by military planners in different countries around the world, and they'll range from huge numbers of troops on the ground right down to small numbers. In reality, you won't know what the shape of the force or any capability is going to look like until there's a peace agreement. And once there's a ceasefire that people can sign up to. Once you've got that, you've got a start point, and then all the other planning can be brought together, and you then work out the bill for what you'd need to provide an ideal capability in the ground. You then take that bill out as a shopping list to different countries and say, who can provide what? Some of that work is going on at the moment, but invariably the countries come back and go, promise a lot less than you actually need to provide that optimal military capability, and therefore you redesign your plans to be able to do something that will be on the road to the effect that you're trying to achieve, which is a long-lasting peace and security agreement. We have to be very careful with talk of putting China into position, because China and Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin, as we saw at the parade in China, are part of the axis of evil, and therefore that would not bode well for Western influence into Ukraine. And China would love, I think, to get that sort of influence into Europe, and therefore that's I think Donald Trump is being naive in looking at that. But we are a long, long way off it, and the worst thing that we could ever do is have security guarantees that are treaties on paper but don't have any military capability physically backing them up, because of course we had that with the Budapest Memorandum, that Russia, United States, United Kingdom, France and others gave security guarantees to Ukraine for giving up its nuclear arsenal, and that piece of paper has been ignored completely.
And how close we are to any kind of a ceasefire deal or a peace deal between Ukraine and Russia? Because President Trump seems to be very optimistic about the possibility of reaching the deal anytime soon. He is confident that the deal would be reached this or next year, probably.
Donald Trump's always confident that he could do a deal. He's not very good at doing deals, and he's not very good at analyzing the markets. He has had a number of failed businesses behind him. But I don't think that Vladimir Putin is ready for any form of deal at the moment. President Zelensky has presented some very clear plans and very for a road to peace, and has set out a number of conditions that are very conciliatory and are realistic in their views. But Vladimir Putin is not interested in even thinking about them. He's not interested in trying to come down and negotiate properly with President Zelensky. So Vladimir Putin is the one who is nowhere near wanting to get to the negotiating position at the moment, and I don't think he thinks he needs to be, because he feels emboldened. He's been seen on the global stage side by side with Donald Trump. He controlled that meeting in Alaska. That was quite clear by the body language in the press statement that was made at the end of that meeting. Vladimir Putin will feel emboldened by being beside Xi Jinping and Kim Jong-un and other global leaders at the big parade in Moscow. So Putin is feeling, on top of his game, and he believes still that he can win militarily in Ukraine, even though the reality is showing something different. But I think Ukraine's tactics of attacking Russia's ability to continue to fund the war by attacking the oil and gas processing infrastructure, attacking railway hubs, logistic hubs, command and control centers, audacious attacks like Operation Spider's Web against Russian strategic military capability, is beginning to hurt Russia. But the one that's hurting Russia most is the oil and gas infrastructure, where the average Russians are now having greater and greater difficulty in getting access to fuel for their vehicles. And it's interesting that both Moscow and St. Petersburg are being protected because of the Moscow and St. Petersburg bubbles that are needed. Because the one thing that Vladimir Putin fears most is the Russian people rising up. He can control the number of people he needs to recruit to put onto the front lines. He can control the outer reaches of Russia. He can control what his oligarchs are doing. He can control what his military is doing. He's got control over the international community in many ways through Donald Trump. But what he can't control are the Russian people if they start to rise up against him. There's no indication of that at the moment, but that could happen very quickly if there's growing unrest.